right, fantasy fans, get ready, because today we are taking a deep dive into some of fantasy's most iconic villains. The ones who seem like they just can't be beat, but they are. We're talking the big names, Voldemort, Thanos, Sauron, that kind of crew. Our source material for this deep dive is this article from Screen Rant. It's called Five Fantasy Movie Villains. So powerful, they should have been unstoppable, but got beat anyway. And yeah, the article makes it clear that these villains lost. But that's not really the point. The really interesting part is how they lost. Like, how is it that their overwhelming power just failed them in the end?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's often what makes these stories so compelling, right? It's not just good versus evil. It's the cracks in that facade of power. You start to see deeper truths about the characters and their world, and
Yeah.
I think maybe even about ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. So let's start with maybe the most famous villain on the list. He who must not be named, Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. Voldemort is incredibly powerful, no doubt about it. He's got the magic, the strategic mind, and he knows how to instill fear. But the article points out that Harry doesn't actually beat him by being a stronger wizard.
Right, it's not like some epic magical duel.
Mm.
The article says Voldemort's fatal flaw is that he just can't understand love. It's like a blind spot. And it leads him to make some pretty big mistakes.
Yeah.
Ultimately, those mistakes lead to his downfall.
That's what I find so fascinating. He's so focused on power, on conquering death. Anything outside of that just doesn't make sense to him. Love, compassion, selflessness, he sees those as weaknesses. So he never sees them coming. He never expects that that could be his undoing. Makes you think, right, how often do we dismiss things just because they don't fit into our worldview?
That's a good question. I'd say probably more often than we realize. And yeah, just like Voldemort, that can make us vulnerable too.
For sure. All right, next up, let's jump into a true fantasy classic. Ridley Scott's Legend. You ever seen this one?
Oh yeah, Legend. It's a classic.
Yeah, it's become a bit of a cult classic, I think. And the villain here is pretty unique. We're talking about darkness himself, like literally the embodiment of evil. Wants to cover the world in darkness.
Darkness. And the article mentions something interesting about him. They say that maybe the visual spectacle of darkness makes up for what could be a weaker story.
Yeah.
So it's something you see a lot in fantasy films these days.
Yeah.
Amazing visuals. But maybe the story isn't quite as deep.
Right, and there's this detail about darkness being obsessed with the heroine's innocence. It's like this total contrast, pure evil, drawn to pure good, almost like he's fascinated by what he can never be, what he wants to destroy. What do you think? Are the visuals enough to make up for a maybe simpler story, or do you need more from your fantasy?
That's tough to say. I think it depends on the person, right? Some people are totally fine with visual storytelling. Others need a really intricate plot to stay engaged. It's a balancing act, for sure.
Yeah, it is. All right, let's move on to a villain who actually wins, at least for a little bit. We're talking about Thanos from the Avengers films. Now, in Infinity War, he actually achieves his goal. He wipes out half of all life. That's pretty wild. We don't often see the villain win.
Yeah, Infinity War definitely shook things up. It's such a bold choice to have the villain actually succeed. Makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Absolutely.
And the article even talks about the possibility of alternate universes. Universes where Thanos stays on top. Just imagine that.
Whoa, mind blown. But even though Thanos wins for a while, the Avengers eventually do beat him in Endgame. But it's not easy. It takes a ton of luck and determination and sacrifice. They really have to climb out of a hole to get there. It kind of reminds me of those goals we set for ourselves, the ones that seem impossible at first. But if we're persistent and maybe get a little lucky, we can achieve some pretty amazing things. Have you ever had a goal like that? Something that felt totally out of reach, but you found a way?
Oh, for sure. I think we've all had moments like that. We surprise ourselves.
Right.
Like there's this hidden strength we didn't even know we had.
Yeah, you tap into something.
And sometimes I think it's the challenges, the times we're pushed to our limits.
Yeah.
That's when we really see what we're capable of.
Totally. It's crazy how these fantasy stories can make us question so much. Our ideas about power and success and even our place in the universe.
Absolutely. Even fictional worlds can be so complex. And they remind us that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a chance for hope, for change, for different outcome.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And speaking of powerful characters, let's head over to Narnia, where we meet the White Witch from the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, with the new Narnia adaptation coming out. I can't help but wonder how they're going to portray her. Tilda Swinton was so good in the original, just so chillingly perfect.
Yeah, that's going to be tough to top. Swinton brought such a unique presence to the role. Regal, but menacing.
Yeah, exactly. She's not just some power-hungry villain. She's intelligent, she's manipulative, and her magic is seriously powerful. But what's interesting is that her defeat, it's not just because of Aslan or the Pevensey kids. Destiny, maybe even divine intervention, plays a big role. Makes you think about that age-old question. Do we really control our own destinies? Or are we just along for the ride?
It's a question that's been around forever.
Huh?
Philosophers, storytellers, everyone's been trying to figure it out. Do we make our own choices, or are we just pawns in some bigger game?
It's something I think about a lot. Those times when everything just falls into place, or when something totally unexpected happens, it really makes you wonder how much control we actually have.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
One we might never have a definitive answer to,
Right.
but maybe that's part of the beauty of it all.
I like that.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Uh,
About free will and destiny and all that.
and those big questions can lead to some pretty unexpected outcomes. Which brings us to our final villain, the big bad himself, Sauron from The Lord of the Rings. His power is different from the others we've talked about. It's not just strength or magic, it's this feeling of influence, this presence that just hangs over everything, covers all of Middle-earth.
That's a good point. The article mentions that too. They talk
Mhm.
about how Sauron is this huge looming threat in the original trilogy. You constantly feel him, even though you rarely see him. But then in The Rings of the Power, you get his backstory. You see him in a different light. Still powerful, of course,
Mm.
but with vulnerabilities, with a past that explains why he is the way he is.
Right, in the movies, it's like this heavyweight just pressing down on everyone, always there, always watching. And it's interesting because Frodo, the Hobbit, who's supposed to destroy the ring, he doesn't actually do it. It's Gollum, this creature who's been totally corrupted by the ring. He ends up destroying it almost by accident.
Wow. Yeah. That whole thing with Gollum, it's a good example of how chance can play a role in these stories. You can have all these carefully laid plans, but sometimes things just happen in ways you could never predict.
And that makes me think about those moments in real life when something unexpected happens, something you have no control over, and it changes everything. Those twists of fate that send you down a completely different path.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Those moments when you realize life doesn't always go according to plan.
Right. It's like those detours. Sometimes they lead to something even better than you imagined.
Exactly. Sometimes the best things in life are the things you never saw coming.
Okay, so we've taken a deep dive into these iconic fantasy villains. We've seen how they fall from grace. What do you think are some of the big takeaways here? What patterns do you see in their downfalls?
Hmm. Well, one thing that stands out is that even the most powerful beings have weaknesses. Voldemort couldn't understand love. Some villains rely too much on one plan, and sometimes fate just has other ideas. No one is invincible.
It's like that saying, pride comes before the fall. So many of these villains are blinded by their power, their ambition. They underestimate their opponents. They don't even consider the possibility that they could lose.
Exactly. And it's not always strength that defeats them. Sometimes it's the hero's cleverness, their resilience, their willingness to sacrifice. It shows that there's more to strength than just raw power. Compassion, selflessness, the ability to adapt and keep going even when things are tough.
It's a powerful message. Even when facing huge challenges, there's always hope. And victory can come from the most unexpected places. It reminds us to be open to possibilities, to never give up, and to maybe even embrace a little bit of luck.
Yeah, it's like these stories are telling us, don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone. Don't be afraid to challenge yourself. You never know what you might be capable of.
Well said. So to wrap things up, if these seemingly invincible villains can be defeated, what does that tell us about the power we have within ourselves? What incredible things could we accomplish if we embrace our strengths and our weaknesses, and if we stay open to the unexpected twists and turns that life throws at us?
That's a great question, one that each of us has to answer for ourselves. But I think these stories offer us a glimpse of what's possible. They remind us that we all have the potential for greatness, for courage, for resilience, and that even when faced with seemingly impossible odds, we have the power to make a difference.
That's a beautiful thought. It's been an amazing journey exploring these iconic villains with you and unpacking the deeper meaning behind their downfalls. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of your own story.
Yeah, and sometimes it's those detours, those stumbles that lead you to the best stuff.
It's so true. It's all about rolling with the punches, right?
Yeah.
Learn and grow and never give up.
So I guess what I'm taking away from this deep dive is if these big bad villains can be taken down, then we can achieve anything.
I like that.
We just got to embrace who we are,
Totally.
strengths, weaknesses, the whole shebang, and be ready for whatever life throws our way.
I think that's the magic of these fantasy stories. They show us what's possible. We all have the potential for greatness, courage, resilience. We have the power to make a difference.
It's been awesome exploring these villains with you and figuring out what their downfalls really mean. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure. And for everyone listening out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep believing in the power of your own story.